Joseph Smith, supposedly according to his own story, says, in the midst of this war of words and tumult of opinions, I often said to myself, what is to be done? Who of all these parties are right, or are they all wrong together? If any one of them be right, which is it, and how shall I know it? It's interesting that he says here in verse 10, or are they all wrong together? He says that thought crossed his mind. Yet later on in verse 18 he says, for at this time it had never entered in my heart that they are all wrong. What most people don't realize is that I just read you from verse 18 was an insertion after the original was written. So Joseph Smith sort of contradicted himself later on, possibly in response to some of the criticism he had come against. But be that as it may, he says, while I was laboring under the extreme difficulties caused by the contest of these parties of religionists, I was one day reading the Epistle of James, 1st chapter and 5th verse, which reads, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. Never did any passage of Scripture come with more power to the heart of man than this did at this time to mine. It seemed to enter with great force into every feeling of my heart. I reflected on it again and again, knowing that if any person needed wisdom from God, I did. For how to act I did not know, and unless I could get more wisdom than I had, I would never know. For the teachers of religion of the different sects understood the same passage of Scripture so differently as to destroy all confidence in settling the question by an appeal to the Bible. At length I came to the conclusion that I must either remain in darkness and confusion, or else I must do as James directs, that is, ask of God. I at length came to the determination to ask of God, concluding that if he gave wisdom to them that lacked wisdom, and would give liberally, and not upbraid, I might venture. So in accordance with this, my determination to ask of God, I retired to the woods to make the attempt. It was on the morning of a beautiful clear day, early in the spring of 1820. It was the first time in my life that I had made such an attempt, for amidst all my anxieties I had never as yet made the attempt to pray vocally. After I had retired to the place where I had previously designed to go, having looked around me, and finding myself alone, I kneeled down and began to offer up the desires of my heart to God. I had scarcely done so when immediately I was seized upon by some power which entirely overcame me, and had such an astonishing influence over me as to bind my tongue so that I could not speak. Thick darkness gathered around me, and it seemed to me for a time as if I were doomed to sudden destruction. But exerting all my powers to call upon God to deliver me out of the power of this enemy which had seized upon me, and at the very moment when I was ready to sink into despair and abandon myself to destruction, not to an imaginary ruin, but to the power of some actual being from the unseen world, who had such marvelous power as I had never before felt in any being, just at this moment of great alarm, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head, above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. It no sooner appeared than I found myself delivered from the enemy, which held me bound. When the light rested upon me, I saw two personages, whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, This is my beloved Son, hear him. My object in going to inquire of the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right, that I might know which to join. No sooner, therefore, did I get possession of myself, so as to be able to speak, than I asked the personages who stood above me in the light which of all the sects was right, for at this time it had never entered in my heart that they were all wrong, and which I should join. I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong. And the personage who addressed me said that all their creeds were an abomination in his sight, that those professors were all corrupt, that they draw near to me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men, having a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. He again forbade me to join with any of them, and many other things did he say unto me, which I cannot write at this time. When I came to myself again, I found myself lying on my back, looking up into heaven. When the light had departed, I had no strength, but soon recovering in some degree, I went home. And as I leaned up to the fireplace, Mother inquired what the matter was. I replied, Never mind, all is well, I am well enough off. I then said to my mother, I have learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true. It seems as though the adversary was aware, at a very early period of my life, that I was destined to prove a disturber and an annoyer of his kingdom. Else why should the powers of darkness combine against me? Why the opposition and persecution that arose against me almost in my infancy? Then he goes on to say that he was persecuted by teachers of religion for having told about his first vision, and so on and so forth. This is the substance of the first vision. I think it's important to point out that Mormonism feels that this is an extremely important thing. For example, Bruce R. McConkie, apostle of the Mormon Church, died just a couple of years ago, in his book Mormon Doctrine said, This transcendent vision was the beginning of Latter-day Revelation. Through it, the creeds of Christendom were shattered to smithereens, and because of it, the truth about those beings whom it is life eternal to know, began again to be taught among men. Mormon Doctrine, page 285. The first vision provides the Mormon Church with a great deal of basis for its teachings. The Mormon Church, of course, teaches that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and if God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to Joseph Smith, that obviously would help him in his claims that he was a prophet. Mormonism claims that it teaches polytheism, the belief in more than one God. For example, it teaches that God the Father has a body of flesh and bones, as tangible as any man's. He is a separate, distinct God from Jesus Christ. And since Joseph Smith saw them both as physical beings, then this would obviously support that as well. And so the first vision is very, very important to the Mormon Church today. But the question is, did the first vision take place? Mormonism claims that it really happened. That it wasn't just simply some spiritual experience and that it really didn't happen, but it actually took place at a specific time and a specific place. That is, in the woods, in Manchester, in 1820, the spring of 1820, to be perfectly exact about it. That is in their own scripture. If it didn't happen that way, then their scripture is wrong, and therefore the Mormon Church is wrong at the same time. What we will look at today is the information that up until January of this year was available to all people to demonstrate that Joseph Smith's story is untrue. Next week we will look at the new information that just simply is icing on the cake, in my opinion, that closes the door, nails the door shut, however you want to put it, in saying that what Joseph Smith said occurred in 1820 did not occur at all. We will be looking at that information, and that's going to be the bulk of what we examine today. First of all, let's remember that Joseph Smith claims that he was immediately persecuted by people in the surrounding area for telling people about his first vision. And in fact, if you'll listen to the Mormon missionary films, you'll hear that this is mentioned in those films. The fascinating thing to me is that there is no mention of the first vision of Joseph Smith in any Mormon or non-Mormon source before the year 1832. What's even more interesting than that is that, for example, in 1834, the first quote-unquote anti-Mormon book was published by E.D. Howe called Mormonism Unveiled. In this book, almost every aspect of Mormonism is attacked, the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, and everything else, but no mention whatsoever is ever made of Joseph Smith claiming to see God the Father and Jesus Christ. None at all. The fact is, though the Mormon Church today says that Joseph was persecuted for telling people about the first vision, that is a story that was made up 20 years after the vision supposedly took place. There is no contemporary evidence whatsoever that Joseph Smith told anybody about a first vision in 1820 or in any of the 1820s at all.